Chapter 11, Part 9. So we're going to move on to propagation of action potentials. I know that this unit is really, really long and there's a lot of screencasts, but just bear with me here. I'm trying to break this up so it makes sense for you guys. Little, repeat of what I've said already. An action potential will fire only if threshold is met. So only if we get enough stimuli in there to cause the overall charge to go from around -80 millivolts up to -55 millivolts. So when I ask you what threshold is, if I ask you what threshold is, that is the minimum amount of stimuli that's got to happen in order to cause an action potential. And that number is -55 millivolts. So there's a couple of different ways that the action potential will propagate along the axon of the neuron. And the first one we'll talk about is continuous conduction. So basically it's when an action potential in one site causes an action potential at the next location, and it just goes along the surface of the axon. It cannot go backwards because the initial action potential site is depolarized, and that yields a one-way conduction of the impulse. So continuous conduction happens in non-myelinated axons, whereas saltatory conduction happens in axons that are myelinated. So that's a difference between having those Schwann cells or the oligodendrocytes wrapped around the axon. Remember, the myelination is made up of either oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells. So if it's white matter, if it's myelinated, which is white matter, it's going to be saltatory conduction, which is slightly different than continuous conduction. Continuous conduction is in non-myelinated neurons or unmyelinated. So basically, this is, when we talked about the outside being positive and the inside being negative, as we let sodium in, it's going to take with them that positive charge. So this charge here is positive, and as the sodium enters the cell, it becomes negative. It takes with it its positive charge. At resting membrane potential, the outside is positive, the inside is negative. But as an action potential travels along the axon, these charges are going to flip, and that allows for that propagation of the impulse. And you can see here, we're here, and then it moves on to the next, and everything reverts behind it. It's kind of like dominoes on a spring, right? Opens, closes, opens, closes, opens, closes, allowing for that action potential to travel. So with saltatory conduction, so again, I just want to make sure I clarify this. So continuous conduction happens in an axon that doesn't have any myelination on it. It happens at a slower pace than an axon that has myelination. And that's because really, when you think about it, it's got to go through all these open and closing of gates, right? So that takes a long time, believe it or not, even though it's like, nanoseconds for it to happen. It does take a long time for continuous conduction to occur. In saltatory conduction, the myelinated axon is insulated with that Schwann cell or oligodendrocyte, depending on where we are in the nervous system. And that Schwann cell, underneath the Schwann cell, there aren't any of those sodium or potassium channels. So we don't have to wait for stuff to leave and enter the cell in order for that signal to travel or that impulse to travel from here to here. So basically, the action potential at the node of Ranvier, right here at the gaps, generates local currents. The local currents flow to the next node because the Schwann cell insulates the axon at the internode, or basically in between. And one of the videos that I have posted talks about how it's almost like a whole bunch of movement happens here, and there's so much generation of power through this. When it goes through that insulated area, it just speeds up. And I think of it as like almost like, and this isn't really how it is, but in my head I think, okay, if this was a garden hose and there's certain parts of the garden hose that is tightened up and smaller, we'll say under the Schwann cells, then whatever's moving through, as it moves from here to here and then into here, it's going to go really fast because it's even smaller. It's going to have more pressure behind it. And that's how I think of it. And so with saltatory conduction, that insulation helps to increase or it decreases the amount of time it takes for an action potential to go from one point to another, or for an impulse to go from one point to another. So it is much faster. The whole process of an action potential is much faster in saltatory conduction in a myelinated axon. All right, let's see. All right, so speed of conduction. So faster in myelinated. The lipids in the myelination act as insulation, and that forces ionic currents to appear to jump from node to node. It's not really jumping, but it's being forced through a little faster. So I added this also here, that there's no sodium or potassium channels under that myelination, so no time is lost during the opening and closing of gates because there's no sodium and potassium gates under there. And that just makes the myelinated axons much faster. So white matter or myelinated axons conduct a faster stimulus. So there are sodium and potassium channels at the nodes of Ranvier, which are those gaps in between those sections of insulation, and that gives the appearance of the signal jumping from node to node. That's supposed to say from node to node. Sorry about that. And so in myelination, in myelinated axons, the speed is affected by the thickness of the myelin sheath, as well as the diameter of the overall axon. So a larger diameter will conduct more rapidly than smaller diameter axons because they have a greater surface area and more voltage-gated channels in comparison to the smaller diameter axons. All right, so we will pick up on the synapse next.